and we will get started. There we go. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is put Iceland on the map for you to give you an idea of where we're going to be. This is a map of the entire country, and the red line that you see is the itinerary that I took when I was there, which was just shy of 2 weeks. You can pretty much circle the island in a week or so and have some extra time to spend in the capital. And other things that you see along the way. But it's quite a manageable place to travel. And it's also very small in population. There's only about 400,000 people total. So that's less than the city of Boston, quite a bit less than the city of Boston, in an area that's about 4 times the size of Massachusetts. And in fact, a good 2/3 of that 400,000 people live right near the Reykjavik area, the capital, which is over on the far west. If you can see from my pointer here, here's the capital. The other 2 things that I'll point out on this peninsula are the airport, Keflavik Airport, where you're likely to fly into, is way over on this peninsula. And we're also going to stop briefly at the Blue Lagoon, which, even if you haven't been to Iceland, you've probably heard of it. It's a very famous tourist destination, which is about down in this area. But we're going to start in Reykjavik, which is the northernmost capital in the world, and yet it feels very much like a small town. Jess mentioned in her introduction that it is a very cosmopolitan place, and I would say that's true. But having said that, you need to understand it isn't Paris, it isn't London, but it's a fascinating town, and it's a very easy town to travel in. It's very old. And feels very small, very intimate. It's so old, in fact, that it was settled in the year 874 and is known for being one of the safest capitals in the world. In fact, Iceland as a whole has probably one of the lowest crime rates of any developed nation anywhere in the world. And it's also a very green, eco-green kind of place, the city and the country. It's a very homogeneous country. There are relatively few immigrants, although that's been changing in the past couple of decades. Only about maybe 5% of the total population is not native Icelandic. An interesting thing about immigrants is that if you do immigrate to Iceland officially and take Icelandic nationality, it doesn't matter where you come from, whether you're from another Scandinavian country or from Thailand or any other place. You have to take an Icelandic name. And that was kind of interesting as we were traveling to see people who were obviously Cambodian immigrants working in a restaurant, but who had a very traditional Icelandic name that they had adopted. Iceland is a traditionally Christian country, as you can imagine, but like many of the other Scandinavian nations, it's not terribly observant. Let's move on a little bit past. I do want to just emphasize from this picture here, you can see just how much water is important to Iceland. Obviously, it's an island, but by far the vast majority of the population, the vast majority of any kind of development on the island is very close to the ocean. And that's partly just because of the geology and the geography, and because water is obviously very important now, as in history, to their economy, which is based to a large degree on fishing. The airport that you see in this slide is not actually the international airport that a tourist would likely fly into. This is the municipal airport in Reykjavik. But as I said, the main international airport is about half an hour out of the city. I do have to show this kind of humorous advertisement that we got. When I went there, Iceland Air, which is still operating, had a really great deal where you could get airfare and you could get a rental car and you could get all of your accommodations as one single package, which is very convenient. And what the way it worked is you got a little book that had accommodations, a little catalog of accommodations throughout the country. And you had vouchers, prepaid vouchers, so that depending on what your itinerary was, and you could change that at the drop of a hat. You could just decide where you wanted to spend the night, contact one of the places in the book, and pay them with the voucher. And most of the places that you're likely to stay outside of the country, outside of the capital rather, are likely to be bed and breakfasts, farmhouses, farm stays. There's relatively few hotels outside of Reykjavik for the simple reason that there's relatively few large centers of population. They're mostly very small villages, or even some places just single farms, farm complexes. But we got tickled by this humorous ad that said that there's no need to bring cheese with you. If you are worried about cheeselessness on your trip to Iceland, don't, because it's a huge dairy country. There is cheese, there is yogurt, there is every possible dairy product imaginable, and you're going to find it in every restaurant at every meal. So if you're lactose intolerant, that might be something to think about. From the people I know who've traveled there since I was there, what I have heard that is encouraging is the degree to which vegetarian and even vegan cuisine is now much more popular in Iceland, particularly in Reykjavik. When I was there, I remember after spending a week and a half driving around the country, we were so desperate for green vegetables, we went to the first restaurant that advertised a salad bar, and were disappointed to find out when we got in there that their idea of a salad bar was basically bacon bits, potato salad, egg salad, cottage cheese, and way at the end, a few little teeny bits of sad-looking iceberg lettuce, plus pickled herring, creamed herring, all of that. From what I understand, that has changed quite a bit. So that's good to hear. But you can imagine in a country like Iceland, one of the reasons for that is that it's not a particularly ideal place for growing the kinds of crops that we would get in other countries, like fresh vegetables. The climate just isn't suitable for that. So what they get has to be imported at great cost, or they grow it also fairly expensively in hothouses. So they do have that kind of food, but it's an expensive country, like all of the other Scandinavian nations. We're going to start in Reykjavik, and these are just a couple of interesting statues. The one on the left is a statue of a famous Viking whose family settled Iceland in 874. The one on the right is obviously a much more modern one, but a very well-known sculpture called the Monument to the Unknown Bureaucrat, which is one of the best known art installations in the whole country. I just did see a quick question in the chat about when the best time to go there is, and that's hard to say, but I would say there's two good times to go, and it depends on what you want. Because Iceland is so far north, it is just south of the Arctic Circle, and as a result, the amount of light there is going to change dramatically depending on what time of year you go. We were there in mid to late May, which is not the height of the Arctic summer, but it did mean that there were probably at least 18 hours of sunshine per day. The sun did go below the horizon, but it never really got dark. On the opposite side, if you were to go at this time of year, which is also very popular around Christmas and New Year's, you're going to have the exact opposite. There's going to be very little sunlight. Only, from like 11 in the morning till maybe 3 in the afternoon will be much sun, and it'll be very low in the sky. So depending on what you kind of want to get out of your trip, you might want to consider going at different times. Summer, the weather is certainly warmer and more pleasant. It's a lot colder, obviously, but despite its name, Iceland is not as frigid as you might think it is. It does have a reasonable amount of effect from the Gulf Stream. So although it isn't warm, it is somewhat moderated, and even the winters are, it's no worse to travel there in the winter than traveling any number of other winter destinations. However, a big reason that people go in the winter is to see the northern lights, which obviously we didn't see because we didn't even see it dark. But I have friends who were just there a couple of weeks ago on a trip around Christmas time, and they had some beautiful, beautiful photographs of the northern lights. So that's one of the big attractions for people going at what would otherwise seem a not very nice time to go. Actually, the picture I just showed you was a rather uninspiring shot from our hotel. But Reykjavik is actually a very pretty town. It doesn't have old architecture in the sense of medieval European cities, but it does have architecture from the late 19th century. There are a lot of very traditional buildings, particularly churches. This is the Althingshúsið. I'm not even going to try to pronounce Icelandic the way it really should be, so forgive me on that. The Althingshúsið, which is the Parliament building. We're going to talk a little bit about the Icelandic language in a little bit. And this is one of the older buildings in the city. It was from the 1880s. And it looks right out onto a big lake right in the middle of the city, where in the background you can see a very modern city hall. Here's a closer up view of City Hall, which was built in 1992. But the city is very walkable, and you'll find very typical Scandinavian architecture. If you've traveled to Norway or Sweden or Denmark, you will recognize a very similar look to the style of houses. And the weather, as you can see, when we were in Reykjavik, it was raining and it was incredibly windy. Do not bother to take an umbrella. There is no point, because even if it rains, the second that you put up your umbrella, it will turn inside out and fly down the street. So just give up. Also give up on any attempt to make your hair look good, because the wind is just going to ruin that as well. We found it kind of amusing that we were, of course, completely wrapped up in winter clothes with hoods and so forth. Well, the average Icelander was riding around in a business suit on a bicycle on their way to work. So they have a very different attitude towards the weather there, obviously. This is one of the main shopping streets in the town. And I'll show you quickly a couple of the major monuments. This is the Hallgrímskirkja, which is the big modern Lutheran church built in 1940. The statue in front is of Leif Erikson. And what's kind of surprising about it is who the sculptor was. It was Alexander Calder, who you may know from his very modern, usually extremely large public sculptures that are in city parks around the world, and his famous mobiles that he constructed in the mid-20th century. So it's kind of odd to see a much more traditional sculpture here. But this is one of the most noteworthy monuments in the city, and you can see it from all over the area. And on the right is another very typical older wooden building. There's a lot of wooden buildings, particularly out in the countryside. We're going to talk about deforestation a little bit too. The wood had to come from somewhere. And as we go through this, the slides, you will see that there aren't a lot of trees in Iceland. And that's because over 1,000 years of history, they cut most of them down for a variety of uses. We'll talk about that a little bit. Just outside of Reykjavik, you see a completely different kind of landscape. It takes only a few minutes to get out of the immediate, there aren't even really any suburbs to speak of in Reykjavik. And in minutes, you are out in the middle of nowhere in a landscape that is completely unearthly and very volcanic. It's extremely mountainous. And as you can see here, even though, as I said, we were there in mid to late May, there were still plenty of snow at the higher elevations. And the landscape is very dramatic because of this. In fact, you can see volcanism practically in real time. Iceland sits on the mid-Atlantic ridge. And if you've ever studied geology or at least looked at a map of the oceans, you know that under the Atlantic Ocean, all the way from practically Antarctica all the way up to the North Pole, is a ridge of mountains under the ocean called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which is where the continental plates are gradually moving apart as new magma comes up between them, and then they are pushed out to the sides. And you can see this very vividly in Iceland because it sits right on top of it. In fact, if we were able to come back to Iceland in a few million years, it would not be oval. It would probably be a rather long, skinny island, roughly like the shape of Cuba, because it would gradually be getting bigger and bigger in the middle. It's only a millimeter or so per year, but give it enough time, and that's where that's where land comes from. You'll see more of that as we go through. It also means that it can be a kind of treacherous place if you're not careful. Iceland is one of those countries that doesn't have too many signs warning you to be careful. You just have to have common sense and not do anything stupid. It also makes it a very geothermally active country. And it's one of the reasons why Iceland is one of the most ecologically green and efficient countries on Earth, because it has a small population, a very progressive government, and it is sitting on massive, massive amounts of geothermal energy. But most of that is fairly recent. For much of Iceland's history, people lived in sod houses and stone and wood farm complexes. This is a ruin. You can see ruins all over the country. Farmhouse foundations from the 19th century or even older. And of course, most of those were made from local volcanic rock foundations, and also wood that came from the vast forests all over Iceland that were gradually cut down. Here are some stone walls lining an old road. But the typical landscape that you'll see is all volcanic rock, a lot of mosses, and just short kind of gorse and heather and things like that, alpine plants. The local joke is if you get lost in an Icelandic forest, all you have to do is stand up. And as funny as that is, it's actually kind of true, because there's very few places where you will see any number of trees. There are a few places where Iceland is actually trying to actively reforest, but they're very few and far between, and mostly what you're going to see is this kind of landscape. The country also has endless waterfalls. Some of them are big and famous, and we'll visit a few of those, and many, many of them are totally unnamed because they're just by the side of the road. We're going to start our trip around the country on an easy side trip from Reykjavik called Thingvellir, which is interesting for a couple of reasons. It's geologically interesting because you can very clearly see the open rift in the countryside that corresponds to the spreading plates, continental plates. It's also very close to what is, I think, the largest lake in the country. And you can see that kind of in the background up here. It's also a very historic location, because for over 800 years it was the site of the Althing, which is Iceland's parliament, considered the oldest in the world. It started in the year 930, and it is still going on today. It no longer takes place here. Obviously, it's been moved to Reykjavik in the 19th century, but the institution has been continually meeting for, I can't do math at this late time of day, but well over 1,000 years. So there are some interesting historic buildings to visit there, including this church. And this interesting set of buildings, which is now the summer residence of the Prime Minister of Iceland. So it's kind of weird to walk. This is a path. The stones that you see on either side here are probably, 15, 20 feet high. But just to really get that sense of being at the place where geology is actually, land is being created as we speak right underneath you. It's a very unnerving experience to feel so close to that. If you've traveled to Yellowstone or similar kinds of places, Yellowstone National Park in the US, there's similar kinds of geology, at least on the surface, and you'll get a similar feel for it. But it's a very pretty place to visit, and it's very easy to get to just outside of the capital city. This river going by the old historic buildings feeds into the north end of that large lake. This is not the lake, but this is a good example of the volcanic landscape. This is an old cinder cone that's been filled with water. And to give you an idea of how large it is, here are some people up at the top for scale. And some sheep. Iceland has lots of sheep. It is not uncommon to see fish drying on outdoor racks like this. This doesn't look very appetizing, I admit. It is one of those kinds of foods that you wonder if they do it only to just kind of torment the tourists, but they don't actually eat it themselves. But actually they do. They've been doing it for centuries, of course, because as a fishing country, where the winters can be fairly harsh, you need to be able to do something to keep food throughout the winter. And much of the way that that was done was by drying and salting food that was caught through the rest of the year. Here's a very typical landscape. We're going to go clockwise around the country. So if we head kind of up to the very northern part of the circle of the country, you can see a lot of isolated villages, many of which may only have 2 or 3 houses and occasional churches. Interestingly, a lot of the churches are not in the villages, but just out in the countryside. Someone is asking about the culture of Iceland. Iceland is, it is a Scandinavian country, although there are some things that make it a bit different from the rest of the Scandinavian nations. The language is certainly very similar. I think probably the most noteworthy things about the culture are that it is highly, highly educated. In fact, we read a statistic when we were there that 10% of Icelanders have published a book. I would venture to say that in the United States, you'd be lucky to get 10% of the population who has read a book. But Iceland prides itself on being a very well-educated country. It's very civically active. It has long had a fairly progressive government, at least in terms of, like the other Scandinavian countries, it's got a very socially conscious and equitable country with high taxes, but also very extensive social services. That's relatively easy to do in a country that's ethnically pretty homogeneous and very small. But those are the things that come to mind first. It's also, of course, a very friendly, very safe country. If you do travel there, you do not have to know Icelandic because you're not going to be able to manage it. But virtually any Icelander under the age of 80 probably speaks better English than most Americans. So you won't have any difficulty managing your way there. Getting around, somebody just asked about transportation. You will absolutely need a car. There's just no way around that. If you are going just for a short period of time and are going to spend most of your time at the capital, you could easily get away without having a car because Reykjavik is fairly walkable, and there are all kinds of day trips or overnight trips that you can take a short tour to see some of the things that are fairly close to the capital. But if you want to do any exploring on your own, you really do need a car. And having a four-wheel drive can be beneficial if you want to do a lot of adventure stuff, but it's certainly not necessary. We had a little subcompact and it was perfectly fine. You're not going to encounter a lot of traffic, so it's a very easy place to drive. I think if you've taken any road trips in any other European countries, you'll find Iceland a very simple, easy place to go. When we get up to the top, I want to take you to a long fjord, where way down at the bottom is the second largest place in the country, called Akureyri, which is at the end of this very long, skinny fjord. We're also going to take this road out to a little town way at the tip out here. It is the largest town outside of the capital, but it only has about 18,000 people. This is the place we stayed, up on the hill overlooking the town. And I should point out that we took this photo at 10 o'clock at night, to give you an idea of what it's like in May, when the sun doesn't really go down until very, very early in the morning, like between maybe 2 o'clock, 4 o'clock. And again, because we were staying in a lot of farm stays, it was a great way to meet local people and learn a little bit about the rural way of life there. I'm always partial to staying anywhere where there's animals. I love any kind of animals. So there's sheep and goats and cows and horses and so forth. This is a view over the town, which is not terribly large, but actually very pretty, surrounded by the tall mountains, which are up to about 5,000 feet high. And it's worth pointing out the church, also another very, very modern church, which has an interesting story to it. The stained glass windows, during World War II, you'll probably remember that in Britain, Coventry Cathedral, which was bombed, before that, they took all of the stained glass windows out of Coventry Cathedral for fear of damage by bombs. And the glass later went missing for a period of time. And they were unwittingly bought by someone in Iceland without knowing what they are. And they ended up installed in the Akureyri Kirkja, which is what you see here, where they remain today, which is just kind of an interesting story that they ended up so far from home. But here's downtown Akureyri. Again, very typical architecture, lots of pedestrian areas, and they had some very nice restaurants. They have arts festivals in the summer. There are a lot of bars and nightlife. Icelanders are big into drinking, particularly in the winter, because there's not a whole lot to do in the winter when it's dark. The fishing industry, as I mentioned, is extremely important all over the country, but particularly in Akureyri, because being on such a long protected fjord, this is one of the few places in the country where the fjords are ice-free through most of the winter, which makes it accessible to ships. This is obviously not my photo. This is a postcard, but I did want to highlight some of the offshore things that you can go to. This is a cliffy island kind of off the coast near Akureyri with 600-foot cliffs. It's a very tiny place, and it's a bird refuge now. If you are into birding at all, Iceland is a fantastic place to visit. There are all kinds of mostly seabirds, many native to the area and others who stop over there on long-range migrations. Even further away and barely visible, there's a slight smudge on the horizon there, which you can't really see it, is another island called Grimsey. And the reason I mentioned it, it's about 20 miles north. It's a very popular place that you can take probably either a day trip or an overnight trip. We didn't have time to go there because it's an island right on the Arctic Circle. The Arctic Circle actually goes through it, and it's one of the few places in the world where you can actually stand and have your picture taken standing on the Arctic Circle. There are about 60 people who live there, in just one tiny little settlement. And from what I understand, they are highly, it's an exciting place to go if you're into birds, as I said, but they even have a little library, a little public library. So the next time I go to Iceland, I have to make sure I make a trip there. So this is driving up the road along the edge of the fjord to the very tiny town of Siglufjord. And we actually picked up a hitchhiker along the way, which in Iceland is totally safe to do. He was a young kid who was walking the something like 20 miles up the fjord to get back to his town to visit his family. And we actually had a nice chat with him about what it was like to live in this really isolated community with only about 1,000 people in it. It's a big herring fishing place. It even has a herring museum and a herring festival. Someone in the chat mentioned that they were told there are some 150 museums in Iceland. I don't know if that's true, but I would not be surprised. Reykjavik is full of museums. Many of them are small, some of them are quirky. And like I said, even in this tiny little town, you can stop and visit the Herring Museum. They are very proud of their traditional culture and are thrilled to have other people express interest in it. This town even has its own little ski jump, which in May isn't very much fun to do, but in the winter it's great. As you head across the northern part of the country on the ring road, this is just a little bit of the kind of landscape that you will see. Again, bear in mind, this is late May and there's still quite a bit of snow. And you really do feel like you are in the big outdoors. In between the small villages, there is almost nothing. You will notice in this picture that the road we're driving on is gravel. And much of the ring road is gravel. Part of that is because of the weather and the geology, because frost heaves and geothermal activity and so forth, having paved roads can be expensive to maintain. So they tend to only pave the road in areas that get significant traffic. So a lot of the road actually is gravel, but it's perfectly drivable, even if you have a little car like this. I was talking to someone who had been there more recently, and apparently since we were there, much more of the ring road has been paved than we were there. And you'll see some of that a little bit later. Someone also, I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat. Oh, yes, someone is mentioning Independent People by Halldór Laxness. It's an amazing book. I would recommend it even if you don't go to Iceland. It's a medieval Icelandic saga. It's a bit bleak, as you might imagine, but it's a fantastic book describing the early, what life was like early on in Iceland. As the person in the chat mentioned, he did win the Nobel Prize. It's a superb book, and I would highly recommend it regardless of your travel plans. Yes, you can see puffins, and I'm going to show you some in a little bit. Here's a good example of an Icelandic place name. This is Sveinstaðahreppur. I think that's a reasonable approximation. It is a Scandinavian language, relatively similar to early Norwegian and also the language spoken in the Faroe Islands, which are now part of Denmark. It is sufficiently different from the other Scandinavian languages, though, that they're not really mutually intelligible. There's similar grammar, and it's a Germanic language. You will definitely see some of that. But as I mentioned, all Icelanders speak excellent English, and there would be no reason other than just pure interest to learn Icelandic. The nice thing about Icelandic, though, is it, as complicated as it looks, and as long as some of the names are, it's one of those languages where once you know how to pronounce it, everything is the same. So unlike English, where different letters and vowel combinations can be pronounced different ways. Icelandic is very consistent. So once you learn the rules, it's not actually that hard. It has also changed very little over the centuries. And in fact, modern Icelanders can read some of their early language, the folklore and sagas, the Edda and other early Icelandic sagas. They can read them pretty well because the difference between modern written Icelandic and the early Icelandic has not changed that much, which is very different from English. If you've ever tried to read something like the Canterbury Tales in the original Middle English, it's completely different and like a different language. More scenes from the north coast. Here's an excellent example of an old farmhouse foundation. There are plenty of places where you can stop and explore the volcanic landscapes. There are lots of little parks with hiking trails. And there's all kinds of interesting, if you're into geology, it's a fascinating place to see, because so much of, not only is there so much geology happening, but because it's such a barren landscape, the geology is very visible. So you can see the layers of volcanic rock, and you can see, you can actually see the history of lava flows right in front of you. This is a lava tube where the crust of the lava tube hardened before the lava that was flowing through it did. So it ends up with this kind of tube. And some other unusual rock formations. And this is a relatively recent volcanic cone. There are some things like this that are only maybe 2,000, 2,500 years old, which in geologic terms is a blink of an eye. So when you think that, you know, in relatively recent human history, this wasn't here very long ago. A big place to stop on the north part of the island is Lake Mývatn, which in Icelandic means Lake of Midges. And it's known for two things. One is the midges, unfortunately. But the good thing about the midges is that it means that it's a huge place for birds. It's a spectacular bird habitat because obviously they come there to eat the midges. Which are worst in July, I believe, in August. June, July, August. So when we were there weren't actually terribly many insects. But the downside to that is there also weren't terribly many birds. If you're there during the height of the summer season, apparently the bird life in at Mývatn is absolutely spectacular. But even without that, it's a beautiful landscape. It's a very large lake and a fairly shallow lake. And like the volcanic cone I showed you a couple of minutes ago, it's very recent. This lake actually formed from an eruption only 2,300 years ago. And you can see a lot of the geology right clearly in front of you. It's a beautiful place to explore, lots of hiking trails. And a couple of villages right on the edge. It's surrounded by lots of dormant cones, volcanic cones like this one, which are interesting to walk around in. This is one good example of one of the places that we stayed, just a bed and breakfast with, where a family rents out 2 or 3 rooms for guests. And not very far away is a couple of really impressive waterfalls. This one is called Goðafoss, which is on a river called the Skálfjandafljót River. Sorry for mangling that. If there's any Icelanders in the audience, I apologize for my pronunciation. This is not a very high waterfall, but it's very powerful, very wide, and obviously very impressive. We had to settle for this because, unfortunately, Dettifoss, which is one of the most powerful waterfalls in all of Europe, 150 feet high, 300 feet wide, and very close to Mývatn, was unfortunately closed or I should say the road was closed because there was a washout. There was no way to get to it. But that was okay because we saw at least 50 other waterfalls along the road. This is the river where Goðafoss is located. Foss means waterfall in Iceland, so you will see a lot of place names that have the word foss in them. You'll notice we're bundled up, and that's because although it wasn't actually terribly cold, it's very windy. And if you spend a lot of time outdoors, which you probably will, because that's the main thing to do, you do want to definitely have good hiking shoes, long underwear, things to keep you warm. Definitely dress in layers because the temperature, particularly in the summer, can vary from freezing to 70 Fahrenheit even in one day. So it's worth it to be prepared. Someone asked, do they have earthquakes? Yes, they do. And they have volcanic eruptions. Here's a rainbow. Because of the weather and all the water, there are rainbows everywhere too. You'll see them just driving down the road, or in this case, here's one arcing over a fjord. Here are some more ancient foundations. And as we head east towards the coast, not too far from Mývatn, as all over the country, there are some really nice geothermal areas that you can visit. This one is actually like a little national park called the Namafjallverðir area. Some of these are places that you can actually bathe in, like the Blue Lagoon, where there are hot springs that you can go swimming in. Others are like this, which you would not bathe in. These are superheated mud pools, which are extremely dangerous, and you don't want to get any closer to them than this. And of course, there's plenty of bubbling mud that blurps and blorps. Just again, if you've been to Yellowstone, this will look similar. And here I am at the top of that volcanic cone that I showed you earlier, pointing back down to where we were. There's a great view back towards the west and also towards the east as well. Not too far from here, you can't see it in this picture, but there's actually a very good-sized geothermal plant that provides energy to the eastern part of the country. Here, again, you can look down from the tops of this cone and see Mývatn off in the distance. And if you like mineralogy and geology, it's just fascinating to see all of the science right in front of you. These are sulfur deposits around the fumaroles, which is where superheated steam is coming out, and it deposits the steam is often full of suspended mineral deposits, which are then left around. And so you can see iron deposits and sulfur deposits, all kinds of interesting crystals, and so forth. You might also not be surprised to find out that it smells of rotten eggs. And that's true not only in these geothermal locations, but even in private homes, because when you have geothermal energy heating most of the water supply, when you shower, that's what it's going to smell like. Here's a really great example of that, where you can see the land splitting. So for the person who was asking about the earthquakes, yes, the kind of landscape that you see that results in this is very often because of fairly cataclysmic activity. And so it's kind of interesting to see in the same village, you can have a very beautiful, typical, traditional Scandinavian wooden church. And then across the street, you can see something like this that this is another place where you can't actually go swimming, but it looks like you could, and you definitely would not. This water I forget what the temperature was, but you would basically burn your hand off if you stuck it in. So you have to be very, very careful when you're hiking, that you stay on marked trails and know where you're going, because there's a lot of things that look tame, but are not. This is the cone that we climbed up, called Fjord, which is about half a mile across. And as I mentioned, this cone was created by volcanic activity only 2,500 years ago. And you can see here, to get up to the top, you just take this little path. And when you get up to the top, there's a fantastic view all the way back to Mivan. Another of the many unnamed waterfalls. And we stopped for picnic. So I think we bought some pizza to stick in the car and Fanta, because we knew that for the next 50 miles or so, there was absolutely nothing. But we did, in the middle of nowhere, find this picnic bench, because in the 40-mile-an-hour winds, where else would you want to stop and have some cold pizza and a soft drink? This northeastern corner is very, very, very barren. There's not much in the way of settlements in this stretch. And you can see the road just goes on, gravel for a very long distance, which made it all the more ridiculous for us to find this caution pedestrian sign in the middle of nowhere. I don't know what pedestrian would ever be walking around here. The yellow posts that you can see on either side of the road are obviously for night visibility, but also for snow during the winter, when snow is blowing horizontally across. It helps you to see if you're driving in the middle of winter. You'd probably want to have a four-wheel drive, but it helps you to see where the road actually is. It is a very windswept country, as you can tell. And in addition to the apparently occasional pedestrian, there was even an airstrip in the middle of nowhere. I'm not entirely sure why you would want to land a plane here, because you're not near anything at all, but if you need to, there it is. This was kind of funny. We took a detour to see another one of the geothermal areas where you could go hiking around. And according to our map, we could take a shortcut, which got back to the main road, which you can see here on the left. Unfortunately, when we got within sight of it, you can see our car here, we discovered the road didn't actually connect. So we had to spend probably 2 hours driving all the way back to reverse our steps, simply because we could not go the last, 300 feet. We did have guidebooks. There are excellent maps of Iceland. And I would, when we were there, this was long before cell phones, and I think we were there 20 years ago. So although the landscape hasn't changed, a lot of other things have. And now, of course, with GPS, cell phones and so forth, I think it would be a very different driving experience, but it's still, I would absolutely invest in a good map of the country. And there are innumerable published guidebooks and online guidebooks that you could take with you that would show you the best places to stop along the way. As I mentioned, if you want to plan to drive all the way around the country, I think a week and a half would probably be a comfortable minimum. That would allow you a couple of days in Reykjavik, and then you could drive around the country in a fairly leisurely way without feeling like you were rushing. There is other wildlife. We're going to see, there's not too many mammals. There are reindeer, and there's some small mammals, but there's not much more than that. Most of the wildlife is in the form of bird life. I'll skim through some of the geothermal stuff because after a while it tends to all look the same. But it does give you an idea of the landscape. And again, plenty of boiling mud. As you get to the east coast, the landscape changes a little bit. It's called Fjord Country, and you will see it start to look a little bit less bleak. There is actually more vegetation, and it's relatively more populated. And this particular long, skinny lake, which is similar to the kind that you might see in Scotland, for example, is called Lagarfier. And it has some wonderful hiking areas around it. It's a relatively populated area, so there's plenty of places to stay. Typical sod roof farmhouse. And we did a lot of hiking around here. Here I am at the top of the mountain singing The Sound of Music, because you kind of have to in this environment. We hiked up to a waterfall. It required a certain amount of agility, as you can see here. Fortunately, I didn't fall in. But this is Foss. You can see it off in the distance up there, and it's over 400 feet high. It's one of the tallest falls in Iceland. And in fact, there's even a smaller fall before you get up to it. And on the way, there's beautiful alpine plant life, most of which is very short and tends to cluster in little microclimates under the stones. And you follow this rugged track all the way up. And this is the smaller of the two waterfalls. You can see the other one way in the distance. But you'll notice the incredible basalt columns here. This is called Cellulose Foss. It's not as dramatic as the tall one, but these basalt formations, which are, if you've been to the Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland, it's similar geology, although here you're seeing more of it from the side. So rather than seeing the tops of the columns, which are hexagonal, you're seeing the vertical side view. And there's a lot of that. You'll see it in other places as we go along. We stayed in a town called Egilsstaðir in this unassuming mobile home at the northern end of the lake. Very pretty area. It's a decent sized town, 2,500 people, which for Iceland is actually pretty big. And it's convenient to restaurants and shopping and so forth. This view, which is from the bedroom that we had, was taken at 2 o'clock in the morning. So again, late May, because we are not above the Arctic Circle, the sun does actually go down below the horizon. So it's not like being way up in the north of Norway. However, it really only got dark between maybe 2 o'clock and 5 o'clock in the morning, give or take. It would start to get darker. It never got totally dark, even when the sun was below the horizon. And the reason I was up at this hour is I still had a bit of jet lag, so I was up reading a book and didn't even need to turn on the light. The place we stayed was also a working farm, and it was lambing season, so that was delightful to see lambs. And someone was just asking in the chat about Icelandic horses. And yes, we did see some. Here is one. They're very furry. They're smaller than your average horse. They're kind of pony-sized, but they are considered to be actual horses. They are a breed of horse, not a pony. And they have been workhorses for centuries and centuries. And as you can see, they're very furry because of the climate. They've been used in agriculture and mostly as a workhorse. They're very sturdy. But with modern technology, agriculture in Iceland doesn't really need horses anymore for the kind of work that they would have done in centuries past. So now it's not really necessary, and breeders are more breeding them as for tradition and for hobbies and so forth, rather than for actual work. But you will see them around the country. This is the area, and someone was asking, no, these are not wild horses. They often are in areas where they are free range, but they are not wild. These are actually domesticated animals. And they are obviously not native to Iceland. They were brought there by settlers at some point in the past. This is a view out over that long valley as we head over to the coast, past numerous more waterfalls. And if you go over this large mountain range, there's at about 2,000 feet, there's a pass that lets you cross into Seyðisfjörður, which is at another town that's at the inland end of a very long fjord, tiny little village, but beautifully arranged along the shore with some very beautiful historic buildings, including this nice church known as the Blue Church. And then looking back again across to this is Egilsstaðir, down at the head of the lake. Here is some more wildlife, an unusual, I had never seen a flock of swans before. Swans are usually 1, 2, 3, you see them in small groups on lakes, and I had never seen so many swans all at once. And they were incredible when all of a sudden they took off across the ocean like this. As you come down, we're going clockwise. So as you come down the eastern side, southeastern side of the country, there is this gravel road that goes along the edges of the cliffs, in and out along the Fjord Country, hugging the coastline. We did have to wash our car eventually. Leads to your car looking like this. And we stopped in a little town as we came down this, you can see my pointer, coming down this coastal road to a little peninsular town called Höfn, which is a fishing town way out on this little spit. Also not a bad-sized town, about over 2,000 people, and a big fishing community. This is the view that you get as you come around the mountain and start to see the southern coast. It's just breathtaking. You can see all the way west along the tongues of several major glaciers. And spectacular big sky. This is the view from our guest house in Höfn in the evening. Höfn means harbor, and it is on this little teeny peninsula and is a fishing port, and is almost completely surrounded by water and also barrier islands and shoals. This is the exact same view in the morning with very different light. And looking back up the eastern coast. And again, here's a very good example of very visible geology. You can see the layers of rock strata in this cliff. And I think I mentioned at the beginning, Iceland used to be forested. Originally, when European settlers first arrived, they estimate that between 1/4 and 1/2 of the land area of the country was completely forested. And starting in the 9th century, settlers started to cut the forests down, partly for building, partly for fuel, and also to create agricultural field and to open land for grazing, because that's what they were doing mostly with cattle and sheep. Now here we are 1,000 years later, and they estimate that less than 1% of the country's land area now has trees on it. Here are some reindeer grazing, free range. And one of the major glaciers, the easiest way to get to the glaciers is all along the south coast, where they are most accessible. As elsewhere around the world, glaciers in Iceland are retreating, alarmingly so. Since the year 2000, Iceland's glaciers have lost about 7% of their total area. which is about 300 square miles. This one called Vatnajökull means glacier. Vatnajökull is the largest of the glaciers at about 3,000 square miles and 1,200 feet thick in most places. It is the largest glacier in all of Europe, if you count mainland Europe and Scandinavia and Iceland. Also, like some of the other glaciers on the south coast, it has a volcano under it, which leads to some interesting things that we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. And very close to that is another popular destination along the south coast. Right, the road goes right by this. Yucca Saron is a lagoon that formed when part of the glacier that I just showed you receded from the coast and left this gouge, kind of the same in a short-term version of what happened here in New England when the glaciers retreated after the last ice age. They carved, left rocks, and carved enormous gashes in the landscape. But it's a fantastic place to stop. It's about 7 square miles now. It's actually growing as the glacier retreats. And believe it or not, in its deepest point, it is 900 feet deep, even though it is right next to the road. And again, that's because of the way that the retreating glacier carved out this, the landscape. But it's a beautiful spot. There's nothing to do there but just hike around and look at it. In fact, here is, if you can see me there, those are the restrooms, should you need one. But it's a great place to see icebergs in miniature, and the unearthly blue color of the ice. As you head along, we're now working our way back towards Reykjavik along the south coast, continuing our clockwise tour. This is another of the major waterfalls called Skartevos, which means black waterfall. And it's a very striking one for obvious reasons. You can see more of those amazing basalt columns. And it's one of several waterfalls that you can actually climb to the top of. They have a hiking trail that lets you go all the way up to the top and look down. This was the first time I had seen anywhere the international symbol for quagmire. The sands around the whole southern coast, in between the mountains and the ocean, there are several miles of extremely flat landscape that's kind of outwash from the glaciers. So there's gravel, there's sand, and a lot of it can be quicksand because water is underneath all of that. So it can be a very dangerous place to go off on your own, even though it looks like a perfectly tame landscape because it's completely flat. This is another place that we stopped at. I would call this a town called Hof, but it isn't actually a town. It is really a single farm that just has a number of families and a number of buildings all in one place at the base of the mountain, and they rent out rooms. So it's more just a small settlement, but it was a great place to stay with, again, animals to be friendly with, and sod-roofed buildings, including this beautiful church. It was, again, lambing season when we were there, so there was a lot of that activity going on while we were there. Icelandic lamb is used for food, but even more so for wool. And one of the popular things that you might buy as a souvenir there is Icelandic sweaters and other garments that are made from wool, handmade. They're very beautiful crafts. Another glacier a little further along is called Mýrdalsjökull, much smaller, but also very accessible. This one's only about 200 square miles. And you can hike right up to this glacier wall across the landscape. Um, and I should mention here, one of the things that makes this, that created the landscape that you see, but also makes it dangerous, is the volcanoes that can erupt underneath a glacier. This is probably the only place in the world where that's likely to happen, except maybe there's some places in Siberia that would have the same effect. There's something called a Yucca Saron, which, don't make me say that again, is the Icelandic word for when a volcano actually erupts under an existing glacier. And you can imagine what that might do if the eruption is powerful enough and all of this superheated steam, water, magma comes up under a glacier. It can very quickly melt enormous amounts of water and rock as well. That is then rapidly swept towards the ocean across this very flat landscape. And they can be devastating, which is one of the reasons why there's not very much development anywhere near where these places are likely, where these things are likely to happen. Most of the towns and farms are in more protected locations where that doesn't tend to happen. Here's another old farmhouse ruin. And a view out over this, this is looking directly south to the ocean. So you can see the outwash plain. It does tend down here to be a bit drier and sunnier in general. It's relative because it is Iceland, but they do tend to get slightly better weather down here and milder weather in the south. Although here you can see some weather coming straight towards us. I should mention too, going back to talking about when is a good time to travel there, one advantage to going there in the summer or shoulder seasons when it's more light out is your vacation is actually longer because the sun is up way before you are. And you can go out for dinner, have a long, delicious dinner, go back to your room and sit and relax for an hour or so. And then you've still got 6 hours at least of daylight where you can go hiking and do other interesting things, including outdoor activities, because the sun, it's going to be perfectly bright and sunny until at least 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. Another close-up, getting closer to the glacier, and where you can see some more of the basalt formations. They almost look artificial, but they are not. These are entirely natural. This is a good example of one of those isolated farmhouses, most of which are kind of sheltered right underneath the mountains to protect them from the wind and the glacier and volcanic activity. But this is a typical scene of what it looks like in this area. You can see pavement here, and the southern part of the country of the ring road has much more pavement rather than gravel that you see in the northeast. But I took these 2 pictures. This is one direction and the other, taken from the exact same spot. There is nothing for miles and miles and miles. This is an occasional settlement. Many of the settlements, and I put that in quotes, have nothing more than a gas station, a small restaurant, and maybe a place to stay. Maybe not. This is probably the most famous, not the biggest, but the most famous of the glaciers. Another one where you can get up very close to it called Eyjafjallajökull. And you may recall this because here I am licking a glacier. I had to put my tongue on a frozen glacier just to be able to say that I did. I know it's childish, but these are the kinds of things you do when you're traveling. What looks here like a lava tube is actually not. This is just very dirty ice. And you can walk right up to the glacier, to the tongue of the glacier. And it caused major problems. You may recall this, it was about 10 years ago. There was a big volcanic eruption underneath this glacier. So it did cause one of those massive floods that pushed, I should probably look up and try and find out exactly how much, like what volume of water, ice, and rock was sent shooting rapidly across the southern coast. It obliterated the highway and completely cut off traffic in the south for quite some time. It also, if you remember, caused major headaches for transatlantic air travel because the volcanic cloud of ash in the atmosphere was right in the worst possible place for major transatlantic air routes. So lots and lots of flights were canceled. And fortunately, because this part of the coastline is virtually unpopulated, there was no major damage other than to the road. But it was a good example of how Iceland is still very active, and at any moment things like this could happen. It also, I remember, caused significant problems for the poor news anchor people who were trying to figure out how to pronounce Eyjafjallajökull. We stayed in this other place along the way, another one that's just a farm. And you can see here we are in our tiny little car. The only other people staying there at the time were a bunch of enormous guys from the Icelandic military who were driving around in this thing. I think our car could have probably driven underneath it. But they were nice, and we had this place to ourselves. A very pleasant place to stay. And the reason we stayed here, here are some scenes around the farm. Plenty of sheep, and again, lambs. And a little cemetery, because again, this isn't a town, but it's the closest thing this area has to one. The reason we stayed in this particular place is because it was very close to one of the most popular, probably the most popular place on the south coast called Vik. Vik means harbor, as in Reykjavik, and it's a very beautiful location. And you can get there, and it's kind of a long day trip. It's about 2.5 hours from Reykjavik, but it makes a good excursion from the capital. And on this map, you can also see some other islands that are a little harder to get to. You'd have to have more time. Jaime and Surtsey, which is the little one out here. Jaime has about 4,500 people living on it, and 8 million puffins. If you like puffins, the south coast is a great place to see them. And Jaime is also famous for, back in 1973, being almost completely destroyed by a volcanic eruption where lava and ash came down and just cleared out most of the town. They did rebuild, and you can still this is about maybe 4 miles or so, you can take a ferry out to it. Quite a bit further out is Surtsey, and tiny Surtsey is famous because it is very new. It is one of the newest pieces of land anywhere on Earth. In the 1960s, an underwater eruption created what is now the southernmost point in Iceland. There are no people on it. It's less than a square mile, but it has been a boon for science research because being a completely brand new environment, it allowed scientists over the last 50 years or so to study how plant life, bird life, insect life, and other kinds of life colonize a completely virgin environment. So it's been a very interesting place for researchers. This is another postcard, not my own photo, but I just wanted to give you an aerial view of the stretch of coastline around Vik, which is why it is so popular for visitors. It's just a spectacular coastline. Only a few hundred people actually live in Vik proper, but it's very popular with visitors because of the volcanic black sand beaches and these incredible rock formations along the coast. Here is Vik from probably the highest point in town, and it looks out on these very famous, distinctive rock pillars. It is a rather dangerous place to be, for a town to be, because it's right in the path of the Katla volcano, which is under another one of those glacial ice caps. And if that volcano erupted like the one did 10 years ago, a little further up the coast, it could very easily wipe out all of Vik. And in fact, probably if it did that, the only thing that would survive would be the church, because it's perched very high on a hill. If this looks at all familiar to you, you might have seen it in a Netflix series that came out last year, which I would recommend if you're interested. It was kind of creepy. It wasn't a horror story, but it was definitely a creepy atmospheric story that was filmed in Vik and takes place there. It was called Katla, named after the volcano. And it's I think 6 episodes. The story revolves around a long-term eruption that causes creepy paranormal things to happen in the town. In reality, that volcano has not erupted in over 100 years, so the people in Vik are certainly keeping their fingers crossed that it stays that way. But if you stay in Vik, you definitely want to explore the beaches around the area with these incredible volcanic formations, more basalt columns, sea stacks. You can see the incredible volcanic sand, deep, deep black, and amazing bird life. Now, remember, I had a lousy camera at the time I was there. And I remember trying to take pictures of puffins and was completely unsuccessful. But these are puffins. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of them. Also guillemots, auks, all kinds of seabirds, many of which dive from the cliffs. So all of the kinds of the species of seabirds that like to fish by diving from a great height, swimming underwater, grabbing fish and coming out again. This is a very popular place for them. So if you like bird watching, it's a great place to stop. You might be more disturbed to find out that you can also find them on restaurant menus, because as pretty as they are and as nice as they are not at all endangered. There are millions and millions and millions of puffins. So as attractive as they are, the Icelanders don't think anything particularly special about them, and you can get fried puffin and all kinds of other ways of cooking puffin. I actually had guillemot, which guillemot, I should have had a picture of one. It's a puffin-sized bird, but instead of having a bright, big, multicolored beak, it has more of a narrow black beak, but it's about the same size. The meat is, I would say it tastes like chicken, but it doesn't. It's very similar to any other kind of poultry. It's a bird, but the meat is very dark. It's almost purple, and with a sort of fishy, salty taste, for obvious reasons. But if you aren't put off by eating pretty puffins, I would suggest trying it out, because it is a very typical thing for Icelanders to eat, and actually tastes quite good. Someone mentioned, I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat here. Someone asked about the Netflix series. It's called Katla, K-A. I'll just type it in. Katla. It also is an interesting way to hear Icelandic. It's in Icelandic with subtitles. So you'll hear what Icelandic actually sounds like. And there are some beautiful pictures of Vik. And as I said, it's a creepy story, but it's not really, it's not a horror film. So I wouldn't be put off by that. It's just a very mysterious atmospheric kind of story. Typical Icelandic foods: fish, lamb, dairy, beef, puffin. Did I mention fish? Those are the big ones. And like I said, they're not really big on vegetables, although I understand that's getting better. Seal and whale, I certainly never saw that. And I have never heard that that is something that would be eaten by Icelanders, because they just, yeah, no. Those are more, seal hunting and whale hunting is more traditional for tribal nations much further north. Bear in mind that Icelanders are Europeans after all, so their traditions, their cultures, all of that is coming from that background. Yes, you can eat reindeer. Reindeer tastes a lot like regular deer, venison. And oh yeah, someone is mentioning, yeah, lots of yogurt, and someone mentioned rancid shark. Yes, I did not try that. It's called hakarl. If you want to look it up. Hakarl is rancid shark meat, which has an interesting story to it. I'm going to keep moving along so we don't, and I'll try and tell the story as we move along here, and look at some more of the South Coast pictures. Hakarl, the only place that we actually saw Hakarl to buy was ironically in the airport duty-free shop. I think because it's a popular thing for tourists to buy to bring home and, you know, horrify your family and friends when you bring it home. My impression is that Icelanders don't eat hakarl now the way they would have done in the past. It's supposed, I did not taste it, so I don't know what it's like, but it's supposed to be pretty foul. And it's at some point they discovered that whatever this particular type of fish is shark meat is poisonous. And at some point in history, somebody decided to bury it in lye underground over the winter. And if you do that and then wash the lye out in the spring, you can eat it and it doesn't kill you. I don't know who was the first person to go through all of that and figure that out. It seems like it would not have been worth it. So now it's considered an Icelandic delicacy, but as I said, we did not see it in any stores except at the airport. And I don't get the impression that, other than being a kind of humorous traditional thing, I don't get the impression that Icelanders eat it on a regular basis. Again, we're heading back towards, I'm going to move through these last slides a little bit more quickly. This is actually the place that I just showed you that we stayed. This is the view from our bathroom, the bathroom window. It really is just an incredibly beautiful outdoorsy. You have to like nature to be there. Here's an amusing sign to watch for pedestrians. I like this because they're wearing traditional Icelandic folk costumes. I never did figure out what this sculpture was. I actually did some research on it recently when I was putting this program together, and I even scoured the internet. I have not found anywhere where I can identify the name of this sculpture. I just remember it was along the South Coast. And these are religious figures who are obviously symbolically under the burden of the harsh life of Iceland, but I don't remember who the artist was or any more about it, but it was very impressive and right by the side of the road. Some of the best waterfalls in Iceland are in this last little bit as we head back towards Reykjavik. This was an unusual one that um, rather than being a waterfall, this was kind of like a water dribble, but it just sort of horizontally went down the rocks rather than falling. But a couple of the big ones to see in this area are Cellulose Foss, which is pretty big, about 200 feet high. And the exciting thing about this one, aside from being very accessible, it's right by the side of the road, is that you can actually walk behind it. There is a protected path under the cliffs that allows you to see what a waterfall looks like from behind. For scale, you can see there's a person right there. And an interesting farm building next to it that was nestled under the cliffs. The other big one that's probably the best known, second best known waterfall in the country is Skartevos, also about 200 feet high and absolutely gorgeous. We were not there on a sunny day, but many of these waterfalls, if you're lucky enough to have the sun out, you can see waterfalls. I'm sorry, you can see rainbows over the waterfalls, I meant to say. Again, here's a person for scale. Interestingly, this fall used to be right on the coast, and the cliff that you're seeing would have marked the original shoreline, but over the centuries, the outwash plain has grown gradually so that it is now about 3 miles away from the ocean. You can see some people up top, and that's because you can actually walk up all the way to the top. They were working on it when we were there, so we couldn't actually walk across the platform. They were rebuilding the platform, but you can actually stand and look right over the edge of the waterfall now. And what a lot of people miss when they go to this fall is that only about 20 minutes away, if you take this little side path, there's what I thought was an even prettier waterfall just because it was so different. Fjord Foss it's smaller, it's only about half as high, but it's completely hidden in this little gorge, which is covered with moss, and particularly pretty just because it's just hidden away like a little jewel, and it's very, very tall and falls into this secret pool. And then finally, as we get back to, remember we started in the place called Thingvellir, where the original parliament was. This, not too far from there, in the same general part of the country, is this valley known for its major geothermal features, including some very important geysers. In fact, the most important geyser in the world, because Glacier is the name of the geyser from which we get our English word geyser. Glacier refers to this very specific one, which has been irregularly, not like Old Faithful. It's been shooting water every now and then, and steam 200 feet in the air for centuries. And there are, again, lots of mud pools, steam vents, hot springs, and the smell of sulfur everywhere. This is catching the geyser just as it's beginning to come out of the water, out of the ground, rather. And if you look out over the valley, you'll see steam. This is not an unusual sight anywhere in Iceland to see steam just coming out of the earth. The biggest and most famous waterfall in anywhere close to Reykjavik is Gullfoss, the star attraction falls. It means golden foss, golden falls rather, and it's pretty close, hour and a half, 2 hours from Reykjavik. And there's a tour that you can take called the Golden Circle Tour, which, if you don't have a car, will take you through several of these major sites that are within a reasonable driving distance of the capital, and they will give you a good sense of Iceland. If you don't have time to do the whole country, you will see some of the biggest and most dramatic sites very close to the city on a much shorter tour. And this is an incredible falls because not only is it so large, but it falls, thunders down into this very narrow chasm. You can see the path that walks down to it. At one point, this was considered for a hydropower generation plant, but the economics of it didn't really seem to work out. And eventually, because it was privately owned, this land was actually owned by an individual Icelandic family, and they couldn't make fortunately for everyone, were not able to make the hydropower profitable. So they abandoned the plan and sold the land to the state. So now it's a protected national site. And it really is quite a place. The river is called the Fita River, and it plunges over these different steps and then finally ends up in this incredible chasm. And here's a view of the river in a more placid area nearby. But since, as I said, Iceland is geothermal pretty much everywhere. So you can find, excuse me, little steam vents all over the place, including in residential areas, which is a little unnerving. We all have cracks in our driveways. But in Iceland, you may actually see steam coming out of the crack in your driveway, and it's just something they're used to. This is a suburb kind of not too far from Reykjavik. And another one of Iceland's very modern style churches, but just down the road from it, there's a little fumarole pumping steam and hot water. We stayed also in another tiny little farm called Sel, not too far from Thingvellir. Here I am attempting to figure out how to use Scandinavian bedding, which is very different from ours. And we're going to end the program by going out to that very long peninsula out towards the airport that goes west past Reykjavik. Also very active geothermally. There's not a lot there. There are very few settlements, maybe an occasional isolated farm, but it's a pretty sparse area and very active geothermally. This is, and there are actual geothermal plants there because it's close enough to Reykjavik that it makes it's easy for them to transport the energy back to the capital where it's most needed. Here you can see our dashboard with our map and steam all over the place. I'm not sure why there was a bathtub by the side of the road. And places where you can stop and see things like this. More bubbling mud. But between the fog, which is a normal atmospheric type of weather that occurs frequently in Iceland, and the steam, it can make it almost impossible to see when you're driving. You can probably not tell, but there's actually a person in the road right there. And we ended our trip at the very far western tip, about as far west as you can go in Iceland. And the southwest, there's a rocky point with some very dramatic coastal rock formations. But what we found bizarre, we never found out what this was. The oddest sight, this was a completely reconstructed medieval Icelandic village. And our assumption was that it was a movie set, but it seemed to have been abandoned. And there was nobody around but us, and no indication of what it was for. But you could tell it had been recently constructed. These were not very old buildings. It was something recent. And it must have been used for some sort of film set, and they were still there. But it was quite a sight to end our trip here, virtually at the end of nowhere. Just a very strange thing. And I couldn't do this program without at least talking a little bit about the Blue Lagoon, which is not very far from Keflavik Airport. It's extremely popular. It's one of the most, probably the most popular tourist attraction in the whole country. And we did stop by, although we didn't have time to actually go in and enjoy the facilities. It's a spa. You can swim in water that's about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can see even in this picture, it's bright blue, mainly because of all the mud, the silica mud at the bottom that reflects this beautiful blue color. And of course, because of the minerals in the water, it's supposed to be very good for you. And if nothing else, it's just fun to sit in the hot water. It's actually man-made and not natural. And I've heard people who have been there who have, it gets mixed reviews, to be honest. It's a fascinating place. It's beautiful. I wouldn't discourage you from going there, but I do have to point out, this is not a natural spring. It is an entirely man-made one. And as you can see, the photos that you see in the brochures always look lovely, but it is actually right next to a geothermal plant. It's also really, really expensive. So if you go there, decide for yourself whether it's something that you think is worth it for you. But even if you don't, you can certainly go by and take a look at it, and that's fun, if nothing else. I probably would have wanted, if I had thought about it in advance, I probably would have gone to one of the completely unknown tiny ones that's off on the other side of the country. The Blue Lagoon can get very crowded, but it's a beautiful spot. And certainly nothing beats being in an environment like that where you can soak in beautiful hot water and mineral baths and so forth. So given that it's so close to the airport, you have to at least stop by and take a look at it. So I'm going to end there and thank you for listening to me. I know this was a long program, but as I said, I will be happy to take any questions or comments. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And then if anyone wants to unmute and ask a question or raise, actually with this many people, probably raise your hand or pop something in the chat and I can definitely answer whatever questions. I'm going to go back to the chat. Someone mentioned Game of Thrones. Yes, actually one of the big, that last big waterfall was features prominently in Game of Thrones. The bedding, yes, they don't tend to have sheets the way we do. You are more likely to have a duvet and that you sleep under, and you sleep inside it. It's kind of interesting. It's not as complicated as I made it sound. Yes, food is very expensive there. Everything is very expensive in Iceland. The abandoned movie set. This was a while ago, as I said, so I have no idea whether it's still there. But it was literally at the far, if you look at a map of Iceland, go as far southwest as you possibly get and follow the road to the end. That's where it was. Skaftafell National Park, someone mentioned, was one of the, that was the place where we went and could actually get very close up to a glacier. That's an excellent place to go hiking. The thing I would mention about hiking is be very careful if you are hiking on your own, stick to marked and designated trails. Because the geothermal stuff, they're not kidding when they talk about the potential dangers. So as long as you are in places where There are marked trails, you're perfectly fine, but there are some areas where you have to be careful, and you definitely don't want to just go walking off without knowing what you're doing. There are any number of guidebooks and online sources that have really great advice about adventure travel in Iceland. As you can see, we were driving a very little compact car, so we didn't have a four-wheel drive where we could go off and do stuff. But there's more than enough to do without having four-wheel drive, and you don't have to do adventure travel to really get a good feel for what Iceland has to offer. But if you do plan on hiking, definitely get some good books with trail maps and specific hiking recommendations. I'm looking at comments. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You're welcome. I don't see more questions. Horseback riding. I did not do horseback riding. It would be a lot of fun, except for the pouring rain. Be prepared for pouring rain. It rains in Iceland. It's windy in Iceland. That's just the way it is. You're going to have probably every possible kind of weather, and it doesn't really matter what time of year you go. Even if you go in August, the weather can be just like you saw it in our photos. You will have more light, but there's still rain, there's still wind, there's still fog. That's but as long as you're prepared for it, it's an amazing place to go. Someone mentioned that there are websites about abandoned movie sets in Iceland. I'm going to start looking at that now. Built for TV series that were never made. That's interesting. That could very well have been what we were looking at. And as I said, I have no idea whether what we were looking at is still there. I would imagine not. Money, Iceland does have its own money. It's the krona. And of course, anything plastic money is widely used everywhere. Historic sites, there are quite a few historic sites, and most of them are in or near Reykjavik, because there just isn't very much of anything outside of Reykjavik, except in a few isolated areas. So Thingvellir is probably the single best, most famous historic site, just because of the history of the parliament. But in addition to actual big historic sites, one of the things I liked most was the churches. The churches are beautiful. Historic churches and chapels around the country, mostly made of wood, in that very typical Scandinavian style, and they can be just out in the middle of nowhere with a dramatic landscape behind them. It's stunning. You might also, someone's mentioning the sagas. I read some of the Icelandic, what are called the Edda, EDDA, which are the traditional Icelandic sagas, and there are good English translations. I think Penguin has a fairly well-regarded translation. They're a little dense, but if you're interested in Icelandic history, it would be worth a try. So someone's asking about my background. My Zoom background is I own a house in Greece, where I would much rather be right now than New England in frigid temperatures. But so that's what my background is. I have done travel programs on Greece, so maybe at some point I can do another one for you guys. Let's see, what else? Oh, I'm happy all of you're all just answering the questions for me. That's even better. For those of you who are following the chat, definitely check out some of the links that people are pointing out. I'm going to make a point to go back and check them myself. But we're running out of time, so I won't keep you further.